We welcome you. We have some folks here in person and a number of people out there in Zoom land. This is the Mayor Brown Lunch and Learn series. We call it All the Buzz. Only when it emanates from our Salt Lake City, Utah office does it get to be all the buzz. But what we want to do is talk about regulatory developments in the life sciences sector writ large, broadly understood. George O'Brien, one of my partners from our Washington, D.C. office and deeply experienced in FDA issues, is here, and we're delighted to have him with us today. And I'm Mark Bonham. I work out of the Salt Lake City office. And we would welcome questions. You can send them in, and we'll ask Ryan to sort of moderate those and make sure we get them and try to address those. We're going to start off and spend most of our time about the regulatory developments and FDA interactions. And then toward the end, we'll talk about how that spills over from the FDA to a number of other places, including investments, mergers and acquisitions, public offerings, and just generally running a business in the regulated space. So George, why don't I turn the time over to you?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks everyone for patience on the Zoom there. Again, I'm George O'Brien, one partner in Mayor Brown's DC office. My practice focuses on FDA regulatory matters for life sciences companies. What we're going to talk about today has a big, just sort of straightforward FDA regulatory compliance component. But as Mark mentioned, we want to think about that a little more broadly. How does that impact not just day-to-day regulatory affairs and clinical trials work for companies, but as we'll see, it's going to implicate not just sponsors of clinical trials, but also healthcare facilities, software, and other digital health technology companies. So I think it's going to apply to all kinds of different transactions, and whether investments or clinical trial agreements, et cetera. And as with all things FDA regulatory and FDA regulatory lawyers, there's a lot of getting into the weeds we could do, but I'm going to try to avoid that for the most part today and stay at a high level and probably focus primarily on drugs, but it's really a stand-in for drugs, biological products, medical devices, but that's really just a shorthand for thinking about clinical trials. And we can go to the next slide, Ryan. Thank you. And you know, as you'll see described on the slide, there's been a lot of evolution in, regulation of clinical trials recently, and for a number of reasons. And as you can imagine, that the conduct and success of clinical trials is, probably the most important development for a company when it's trying to bring a product to market, whether that's their first product or their 50th product or the third indication for their 50th product. And the new regulations, the new guidances from FDA, we often think of regulatory compliance as an obligation and a challenge and potential hurdles, and there's some of that here, to be fair, but it's also, I think, opportunities. And one of those kind of flows out of what we see there is the kind of ongoing impact of COVID. And one of the I suppose, smallish silver linings, relatively speaking, of COVID was that it forced FDA to be really flexible, and it forced companies to be quite flexible. Impact of geopolitical, turmoil and changes has also affected where companies are doing clinical trials. So 3 kind of big buckets we'll talk about. Number 1 is FDA efforts and what sponsors should be thinking about in terms of increasing diversity in clinical trial patient populations. And that includes sort of demographic, race and ethnicity, but also other aspects, making sure you have different age groups represented, women, pregnant women, et cetera, all kinds of, both demographic and non-demographic characteristics. That's bucket 1. Bucket 2, or topic 2, is, and this is really the one that flows out of COVID a lot, is what we call remote or decentralized clinical trials. We've seen that evolving and accelerating over the years, but it took just a giant leap with COVID. And that's going to implicate, like I said, not just your clinical trial sponsors, but technology, software, third-party developers, and even different healthcare facilities, given their sort of increasing role maybe in clinical trials. And then the third bucket is really focusing on how these changes may affect, in particular, what we call orphan drugs or biologics, or other, medical devices for rare diseases. We have smaller patient populations, so all these challenges of clinical trials magnified by a smaller patient population. What can you do? And as I mentioned, we want to try to identify like pitfalls, but also think about what are the opportunities, what are other things you can think about at different stages of a life sciences company. And I think we'll just look at those sub bullets there, just double check you haven't missed anything. There's a lot of focus from Congress on certain aspects of this, I think both on the regulatory compliance side, but also in sort of a push-pull with FDA, asking FDA to require more, but also asking FDA maybe to be a little more flexible using things like real-world evidence. How do you collect that rather than having your standard randomized clinical trials? And I think sponsors have wanted this for a long time. What can we do with all this data we have from patients in hospitals and in the real world? It's obviously maybe from a scientific method point of view, not considered as strong or as reliable as your classic double-blind randomized controlled trial, but there's a lot of information to get there, and companies are kind of getting increasingly savvy how to use that. And I think FDA is increasingly open to that. I think we can jump to the next one or two. So let's start with the kind of diversity in clinical trials. And Ron, you can go to the next one even. There's two ways to think about this. And I think oftentimes folks think about this primarily as kind of a public health and public policy initiative, right? That the FDA and other, agencies in the government have a public health mission to ensure that our healthcare system is working for everyone in our society, all different races, socioeconomic, geographic locations. And so this is I'm going to say the culmination. This is the continued evolution of things that have been going on for a long time. Going back to the 90s when, FDA said, look, we're studying all these drugs in adults, but we're not studying them in pediatric populations. But guess what happens when a drug's available for adults and an adolescent presents with the same thing? It's going to be given to that pediatric patient. We ought to understand that better. So lots of congressional revisions to the statute, lots of guidance, lots of incentives to study in pediatric populations. Also true for women who may become pregnant women, lactating women, all the different health issues that may arise, how drugs are going to impact both the mother and the child in those situations. So when we think of diversity, we got to think of it broadly, but that's the kind of public policy and equity and inclusion aspect of it. But there's also just a scientific piece of it, which is we want our clinical trials to represent our population in the United States or abroad, but also our population, not just in terms of sort of classic demographic characteristics, but what about folks with other comorbidities who we're likely to see in the real world, right? So sometimes we want to think about opening up clinical trial, what we call exclusion criteria. And there's a tension here because sometimes if you narrow your inclusion and exclusion criteria in a clinical trial, you feel a little more confident in what's going to happen, right? Because you're controlling for variables, if you will. But there's a lot of our population that's going to have multiple comorbidities, right? Particularly in aging populations. So when we hear diversity in clinical trials, think broadly, right? And there's a lot of kind of vectors to this, right? Congress passed the law essentially telling FDA you've got to require sponsors to submit race and ethnicity diversity plans for their clinical trials. And that was something that FDA had begun doing. All clinical trial reports at FDA are going to have demographic breakouts and different subpopulations. A lot of that's been reported on the labeling for a long time, but Now it's a little bit more of an affirmative obligation for sponsors. And when we zoom out, think about, different life sciences companies, when you're planning a clinical trial, and now FDA is going to say to you, okay, tell me how you're going to address all the different demographic populations and subpopulations across age, race, ethnicity, sex, et cetera, and you're going to target those subjects for your clinical trial. How are you going to ensure that you're going to meet appropriate enrollment goals? What should those goals be? What are you going to have to do differently when you try to fill up that or try to enroll that clinical trial? And I think that's a really critical issue for a lot of companies. Some of the bigger clients I've worked with who, are probably running dozens of clinical trials at any one time with, multiple approved pharma products. They've actually gone back and kind of audited their sort of diversity within their previous clinical trials to get a better sense of, where they had more success. And what FDA has said here is like, look, maybe we can't do things the way we've always done them. When we think of academic medical centers, here in Salt Lake, you've got an amazing environment for that with the universities and the hospitals. But folks who live in rural areas may not have as much access to that. They may not be aware that the clinical trials are going. It may be too inconvenient to drive X hours from, southern to get up here. And so FDA is encouraging sponsors to sort of think about kind of the targets, but also think about the process. How are you going to identify potential subjects? That means kind of getting out to community-based medical centers. That means potentially thinking about different, economic reimbursements, to make sure that people can get transportation, et cetera, for follow-up visits, right? To make sure you can get all the way through and encourage more folks. There's also a sort of social piece of this where, and we've seen this with COVID and, whether it's vaccine uptake or other issues, that different patient populations have more or less interest, trust, distrust of the medical establishment and the federal government. So just trying to think about how can cross those barriers. Just checking my time. Question.
Yeah. As you try to implement some of these things, are you seeing any concern or pushback from companies on how it affects enrollment?
Yeah, I think absolutely. So, that's the biggest question that came up originally when FDA kind of developed its guidance, and Congress follows up and says, you have to have this plan, enrollment targets, steps you're going to take, and then reports on whether you've met those or not and how you're going to mitigate it. The good news in the law is that FDA has a lot of flexibility. There's sort of waiver provisions for scientific and other reasons. So I think a sponsor in that situation, just like most interactions with FDA, frankly, is you've got to think about, what your message is going to be, and it's got to be, something you can stand behind. You can't say, this is who we got, right? You have to say, we took XYZ steps to enroll this. Here's kind of what our target is. Here's the registries available. Here's our facilities. We have, 47, healthcare practitioners as clinical trial investigators in diverse regions. So I think when you have trouble where you don't meet those goals, you want to be able to explain to FDA, what you've done procedurally to target that. I don't think FDA wants to be in the business of being the police on this so much, right? I think it's more of a carrot than a stick, so to speak. There are some provisions, though, that if companies aren't really following the steps or making the appropriate reports, FDA has some authority to slow down their application or pull back on the clinical trials. And I think that, when we'll get to the rare disease issue, but we'll jump ahead to that. When this law was being developed, I had a couple of clients whose companies focus only on rare disease development. And we were trying to get, frankly, a kind of an exemption more broadly for orphan drugs into the statute, which didn't make it in, but I think some of the waiver provisions have accounting for, look, and even within orphan drugs, some of those are 1,000 patients, some of those are 200,000 patients. So I think FDA is going to take a pretty reasonable common sense approach. If you've got an ultra rare disease, they're going to take, I think, the data that they can get, right, and a sliding scale from there. But, and then Ryan, just to be clear, if anyone has questions as we're going through, you know, don't be shy. And then, oh yeah,
Yeah, I'm thinking about OUS type of trials too, and you know, you're dealing with very different demographics. So,
Yep.
and I guess the sponsor just basically needs to address that then and say, if we're gonna do Poland and Colombia and Australia, then how are we gonna get African Americans? I mean, we're gonna have to address that.
exactly. And that's been ongoing, I think, for a while from just a scientific point of view. Is this representative in terms of a clinical judgment? I'm blanking on the name of the product, and maybe that's for the best, but there was an oncology product a couple of years ago where the clinical trial was conducted only in China, and the FDA refused to approve it. Just sort of saying, there are times when you can establish a bridge. You know, for much of America, the European trials is a little more scientifically relevant, you know, in terms of those things from, you know, certain demographic points of view. But if you can establish to the FDA a scientific rationale why this patient population is just as representative, or these locations when pooled together provide a better, yeah, but that's a, you know, further challenge, you know, and I think obviously with, you know, geopolitical issues, that's really altered how companies are thinking about trials. I mean, Eastern Europe has been a favored place for clinical trials for US sponsors as well. But I think for, you know, a monolithic approach, like that one trial described, that one product, is probably not the best bet, right, for ex-US trials. Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, while we're sort of pivoting to the next topic, you know, remote and what we call decentralized clinical trials, you know, on some level, again, this is something that's been happening for a long, long time. Most clinical trials don't occur in one site with 500 subjects, right? You have multiple. And FDA has been skeptical in the past sometimes of having 500 investigators with 2 subjects each in your clinical trial, because that, I think the agency perceives that as kind of seeding the marketplace, sort of a pre-commercial, pre-approval commercialization. And that's a little bit of an extreme, you know, example in terms of the numbers. But, you know, this is the one that I think has just been, you know, increasing and evolving the most, just because of technology. Number one, right, and telehealth. But with COVID, the doors have really opened. And interestingly, the doors seem to have been remaining open. And we're getting kind of, rather than ad hoc guidance in April 2020 about what you can do and how we're going to manage through the worst of it, now we're getting kind of formal, forward-looking guidances from FDA saying, okay, you know, this is what we've learned. This is what we're concerned about. This is what we recommend sponsors think about. And, you know, this one, I think, poses a lot of challenges for things like clinical trial agreements, but also if you are thinking of kind of a classic, you know, investment stage or licensing stage where a company's done maybe non-clinical work in a small phase 1 trial, kind of established safety, but they don't have the money yet for the full phase 3 clinical trial. And so making sure, you know, a company in that situation or a potential investor is thinking through these issues, I think is important, because again, it's regulatory hurdles, requirements, gatekeeping, but it's also opportunities, right? If you're thinking about, well, we want to get a more diverse patient population, step number 1 is, how do we expand our scope in geography, right? How do we get into, you know, areas of the different communities that we haven't in the past? And how do we make it easier for subjects to participate in clinical trials? And this runs the range from, you know, we can go one more slide, maybe, Brian. too. You know, and I guess I should have said this a little bit at the top too, is, you know, all these developments are, you know, sort of on the detail side. It doesn't change FDA's authority under the statute, under the law, doesn't change FDA's standards for thinking about when is a product safe and effective? When are we going to clear this device or approve this device or approve this drug or biologic for use in the marketplace and for patients? So it's not really lowering or adjusting the standards at all. I've always been case by case and benefit risk, but it's saying, how do we get the data to make that evaluation? And how do we make sure that that data, which is collected remotely, which is collected on our phones, which is collected on our, you know, sensors or watches, or is reported by the patient on their phone, how do we make sure that data is just as, you know, we're just as confident in that data, it's just as valid as your classic double-blinded randomized clinical trial. So I think the benefits of this, I think, are fairly obvious. You get broader patient population, you can have efficiencies, you can get geographic diversity, ethnic diversity, socioeconomic diversity sometimes, if you're thinking about how can we use telehealth medicine to get to patients who aren't going to have to come back to the, you know, urban academic center or hospital for follow-ups? How can we use community-based healthcare delivery systems or, you know, practitioners to get to patients where they are subjects for clinical trials? And I think this is also the topic that has like a tentacle that reaches into every life sciences company, right? Because it's things like software, even basic stuff that a French literature major can understand, which is, you know, software to make sure everyone's got their informed consent document signed and reported back, you know, rather than the old days where you're signing everything, but just doing that electronically. It's got huge impacts for medical devices, right? And that is not necessarily the development of a medical device, but the use of different medical devices and digital health technologies to help in like drug and biologic trials. And I think it also impacts other entities. Like I said, it's going to impact healthcare practitioners. It's going to impact community hospitals, local and regional medical centers. I think we're going to see more clinical trials, more places doing clinical trials who haven't done them as much. So maybe they don't have the same infrastructure themselves in terms of like, if you go to the, you know, universities here, they've got a staff that knows about informed consent, that knows about an institutional review board, and they've been doing it a long time for a lot of different people. So, and other places are not going to have that. So it affects training, it affects record keeping, it affects data privacy, it affects healthcare information privacy. So I think this is the one that's got, you know, I sort of joke every conference or presentation or time I turn and look at the trade press, like AI and, you know, whatever, drug development, AI and
Popsicles.
everything, right? You know, it really does touch every aspect, I think, of a life sciences company who's into, you know, who's going to be related to developing medical products approved by FDA as these remote and decentralized trials. It also raises additional challenges, right? Because, you know, one of the things we've kind of benefited from, so to speak, with COVID, I think, is an opening up of telemedicine in particular, and particularly cross intrastate telehealth. You know, I'm in the Washington, D.C. office, so I live in Maryland suburbs, but you know, you could have your doctor in Virginia, the District of Columbia, or Maryland, depending on where you live and what's convenient and where you work. So being able to access that without going into the office has been important. And I think some of that remains in a little bit of a gray area, in part because it's not managed by FDA, or it's not, you know, regulated directly by FDA. It's medicine, pharmacy, the delivery of healthcare services, primarily a state law. So those are, when you're thinking of transactional context and kind of diligencing things to think about, that's, I think, a potential big one. Then, the other piece of it is that kind of, we talk about kind of data integrity and validity, but there's also concerns from FDA, just from your kind of classic, how does FDA review the benefit risk profile of these clinical trial data? If you're using 47 local healthcare practitioners to evaluate patients and their local GP or even a specialist, but locally, that can be a lot more challenging when you think of reproducibility and kind of validity of the data than if you're using 3 radiologists to read the same film, right? Where you have a little more consistency, you can, I think, sort of identify and check for error, or error is the wrong word, variation and inconsistency. So that's a big issue to think about. So again, all these opportunities and the challenges are often intertwined, but just making sure we're okay on that. Good. So I think this is one that, we're going to continue to watch it. I've divided these somewhat artificially into different buckets, but as you can see, these are intertwined. Having remote and decentralized trials, it's going to help building diversity, et cetera. Check my notes, make sure I'm not missing anything on this one, but I think one thing for those folks on the medical device side or the software, digital health side, this, remote decentralized clinical trials is a real opportunity. Like FDA, for those of you who've been through the process at FDA is going to use some of those same strategies and, algorithms is the right word, methods of thinking about evaluating a device. How do we know that patients are going to use this protocol correctly on a software? How do we know they're going to enter their data accurately? So you may have to have some human factors studies for your device that a pharma company is going to use and be able to present that information to FDA. How do we know it's going to be reliable, verifiable? You've got, appropriate privacy and safety measures. Safety is a big concern of FDA, obviously, for all clinical trials. The more remote and decentralized, I think the more nervous FDA gets. So, I appreciate their kind of openness to this, but they're going to be paying, I think, very careful attention to the larger decentralized trials just to make sure you're getting adverse events, you're getting them collected in a systematic way. The subject is going to be, or the patient is going to be protected and have available, adequate healthcare right away to treat a serious or unexpected adverse event. And, one thing I maybe should have said in the beginning of this topic is there's no, one size fits all. A remote or decentralized clinical trial is, again, kind of a sliding scale. And some of them might be sort of fully remote, right, rather than have a main clinical trial site, but some might be a little bit more hybrid. And one of the things FDA has said is, look, fully remote decentralized clinical trial may be more appropriate for a drug product we are more familiar with. We've got an identified safety profile. We know what we're expecting in the trial. And we're more familiar with whatever technology, digital health technology you're using to collect data or to communicate. So
Are you thinking 510K kind of stuff, or could it be an IDE or NDA?
yeah, I think some of the technologies that are going to be used are not even going to be FDA cleared necessarily. It just depends. It's almost like software as a service technology or something. But if I'm using that term right. So far, so good. We'll see. But there are situations where, the technology could be an app on my phone that's a reminder to take my medicine. That's the most straightforward and easy. That's not going to be cleared by FDA necessarily. But it could be a wearable sensor that's taking blood, data or glucose monitoring, just like we have for diabetes and other drugs. So or other conditions. So it can run from all the way the kind of full gamut, I think, from very basic things we use every day and are familiar with technology to really FDA regulated products. That's a good question. Any other questions in the room while we're here or online on the kind of remote trials? Rare diseases. Yeah, well, the good news is, maybe the talking too long on the first two, but this third bucket, and we have a sort of fourth topic too, but I think there's less news there, but it's more of a reminder. But our third topic is really, how do we think about rare disease clinical trials? Again, primarily pharma and biotech. There are medical devices that are used for more rare diseases and humanitarian device exemptions. Sometimes they will have clinical trials, sometimes they will not. So again, primarily pharma and biotech here, but all the same considerations we just talked about. This is already an area that's challenging for companies to develop products. And again, a sliding scale. If you have 1,000 patients, it's a lot harder than if you have 200,000 patients, both of which would qualify as a rare disease for FDA purposes. And FDA has always recognized that from a kind of scientific and clinical point of view, but also I would say just kind of from a regulatory decision-making point of view. There's a term that's not a term of art as we lawyers would think about it, but what FDA calls kind of regulatory flexibility, right? The standard for approving a drug for a rare disease is just the same. The benefit has to exceed the risk. You have to show it's safe and effective in the label, patient population, et cetera, and provide all the data to do that. But what data you need to show for that is going to really vary. So we've heard a lot in the news on some of the, ALS investigational drugs, Alzheimer drugs. They're using perhaps like different clinical endpoints, like sort of preliminary clinical endpoints. They might have a single clinical trial rather than your classic two, clinical trials where you kind of confirm the evidence, confirm the results. And what FDA has done, I think, historically, without, again, changing the standards, is changing how they think about and apply those standards depending on the disease. Is it an unmet medical need? Do we have 7 other therapies for this or not? And so, rare diseases continue to be, I think 60% of the novel small molecule drugs approved in 2022 were for rare diseases for their initial approval. It's still a very important, 60%. Yeah, it's an important, I think, commercial, challenge for companies or opportunity for companies, but it still remains that it's also kind of just a public health, remit, I think, for a lot of these companies that, the Orphan Drug Act was enacted in 1983. There were 7 treatments for rare diseases. And despite having lots and lots and lots of rare disease treatments, there's still thousands of rare diseases that have no treatment. So it all kind of depends on which disease you're talking about. But I think, this is an area I do a lot of work with companies in on orphan drugs, and the opportunity to think about your clinical trials creatively, particularly for small companies, is a really big opportunity, but it's one that you have to measure carefully. Can we do a single clinical trial? Can we persuade FDA? Do we really need 200 patients in the safety database for 12 months, et cetera? How can we use digital health technologies to, get to patients, particularly for things like, rare pediatric diseases or, sort of the ultra rare diseases where you're not going to have everyone at a hospital in Salt Lake, Los Angeles, New York City, Chicago, right? You've got to get out to where they are. So that's a big one. But I think to your initial question, when we're talking about diversity, Mark, that's also going to be a challenge for enrollment, and I think that's a tension. We always have tensions at FDA, push-pull between different policy initiatives. right? Whether it's innovation versus competition, right? And pricing and things like that. But we want to get more drugs approved. Is it better to get it approved for a narrower population or on narrower data? Those are the choices FDA is making, and I think all the time, especially with these challenging diseases like ALS and Alzheimer's. But let me stop there, catch my breath. I'm going to drink of water and see if there are any questions, or I think we're okay on time, but then make sure you have enough time to take us across the finish line. Should we do the code? Maybe you want to check that. Yeah. So I did include a couple slides on compliance and data integrity. And again, this is the part I think that there's no new guidance from FDA. There's no new law on this, but this is the same thing you've always had to do, but you want to think about this through the lens of the other developments we've just been talking about, right? How does data integrity and sort of privacy, compliance, all those issues, how's that going to be impacted by different clinical trial designs? So, but thank you. It's just sort of an overarching or maybe foundational piece for all the others.
We have questions we need to take. Spring, just following right in and on some of the things you were saying right at the end there. Well, you can change the slide when you're ready, but I wanted to talk about some of the recent changes. They've either added new things or.
Sorry to interrupt. Can we just give them like 2 minutes just to write it down really quick?
Sure. Part of the way this spills over in life sciences companies that have traditional venture capital financing is that the representations and warranties they make in connection with selling stock or in mergers and acquisitions or in due diligence and preparation for a public offering, that scrubbing that happens is affected by the regulatory compliance issues. We've always had to comply, but as regulations change or become more stringent, or there are just more of them, there's more to check on if you're looking at this and doing due diligence in a transaction like I've described. So what is your question?
For venture-backed companies, does it also impact the tranching of investments?
It can, although from my perspective, that's not usually tied to compliance. It's usually tied to actual progress with the drug or device, but it could be. We may start seeing people say, look, you're compliant at this level, but now as you move forward, we want to see you comply here before we write another check. So fair question. For the traditional venture financing, a lot of those deals are done with reference to the National Venture Capital Association's documentation. And so I pulled in paragraphs that are either changed recently or added entirely recently. And I think we have 3 slides and then a bonus slide on that. So if you want to go to the first one, I called this, hey, we have the team and the processes. And then you can look at some of the bolded language in there to get a sense of what the investor is looking for. Are you maintaining protected health information? Are you complying with HIPAA? Do we have a designated privacy official and security official? And frankly, do they have any training? Do they know what they're doing, or just paste a name tag on someone? Have we adopted and then been in compliance with the privacy and security things that you were just talking about? And that's rippling through all kinds of businesses, but in healthcare, we have this additional layer to take advantage of. So when you're making representations, you should expect to be queried about this and to be prepared to give a response that allows everyone to feel comfortable that there's good compliance. So that's one of them. There's the actual language in the NVCA form. Let's go to the next one. It's instead of being a representation about what you're doing to comply, this is just a magical one for investors. Please tell me that you're in material compliance with all of the local, federal, state healthcare laws so that I can feel comfortable that nothing's ever going to go wrong. well, we would like that. We would like nothing to ever go wrong. We'd like never to be queried on our regulatory compliance. And you know, what this is going to do in the typical setting is generate the disclosure schedule that's attached to the purchase agreement that says, well, we are with the following exceptions. And you know, the company will work to make those exceptions clear, and then the investor will say, okay, looking at those, what are we gonna do? Maybe it does lead to tranching, or, you know, some sort of remediation of anything that's not being done. But again, very broad language, coverage. Again, you can understand why investors want it, but if you're a tiny startup, it's a challenge. And you don't want to spend all your money just doing this because you've got some other things to do, like develop the science and do the clinical trials. So, all right. And one more example, give me the next slide. So this one I translated to the IPO compliance point is, I've made it, that we need to be in compliance because you will have that question and you'll be writing about it in the S1 and putting in risk factors and describing the business and the regulatory compliance. So I called this one, we're cool with the FDA, meaning we've got everything we need. Again, investors or a buyer of the company is looking for that. We want to know if you've complied with preclinical and clinical trial stuff, if you've conducted these trials in compliance with experimental protocols and procedures, controls. Are you and the FDA getting along well? Because that's enough to blow up a deal or put off a public offering.
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah,
Mark?
please
Sorry.
do.
And this is, you know, one thing I ought to have said earlier, you know, when we're thinking about from the acquirer or investor's point of view in conducting the diligence of a target, a lot of things we can learn from FDA when they have approved products from publicly available databases, from the Freedom of Information Act. The clinical trial stuff at this stage is like a black box for third parties. So that diligence process is important. The company's got to be prepared to, you know, have their materials and explain, but from looking at it on the outside, those steps are more important. It's your only chance, excuse me.
And that, well, and I was gonna say, and that explains why they want you to make these broad representations so that you felt the need to go make sure you're in compliance. And frankly, they've set themselves up for a remedy in some cases. So sometimes it's a practical remedy and sometimes it's not.
Right.
But they do have something they can say. All right. So again, the language is there, you can look at it, but it's broad and it's compliance. And then the bonus slide was for one more thing. And this is, I'm seeing this come up whenever we're seeing financing from strategics that are overseas or just overseas investors. You know, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, which sounds like a healthcare issue, is an investment issue in all kinds of companies, but it's often the case in healthcare, drugs and device issues that we're being asked to look at this. Is it a critical technology? How is sensitive personal data protected? While CFIUS has been around for a long time, it's gotten a lot more attention in the last 3 or 4 years, so that it's now becoming an important discussion in almost every deal I work on. And they're asking, do we need to prepare a submission? Is it mandatory or voluntary? And what do you think the timing will be if we do that? How does that affect our longer plans? So in thinking through any kind of deal now, that's an additional issue, and I see it especially to be the case in the life sciences area. So those are 4 new things, some of which is new language that you should expect to see showing up in deals. Okay, well, George, we're glad that you could make the stop here so we can see you.
Yeah, delighted to be here. Sorry the trip is not longer out here in Salt Lake,
We'll
but
get you blue skies for the next
sounds good.
one. Anything else you want to say to wrap up?
No, just thanks for the opportunity to say hi to everyone and talk about this. Things are always changing, so you just want to keep your kind of finger on the pulse of what FDA is doing. And as I'm looking at your reps and warranties, I'm thinking of 14 other things that we don't have time for today, but there's, the more complicated the world gets, the more, regulatory issues are gonna come up. You gotta just keep your head around.
Any other questions that came in?
No further questions.
And we'll wrap up on the Zoom call, but George and I will be right out here. If anybody has follow-up questions, we'll abandon this room.
Our contact information, if folks on the Zoom have questions, we're happy to chat after.
There are some additional resources too that you may want to look. If you're a brand new startup or you're thinking of being one, go take a look at the springboard things that are there. If you're further down the road, public company, there are going to be some of the pre-writings perspectives that you're going to want to pay attention to. So take a look at these things. We're always happy to help. I love working with life sciences clients. That's a wrap.
Thanks so much.